The faint scent of pine lingered in the air as I stared at the photo perched on my mantel, a snapshot of our last family reunion 5 years ago. Everyone looked so happy. My mom's radiant smile, my dad's boisterous laugh, and my cousin Sarah's arm draped over my shoulder like we hadn't grown apart. And then there was Uncle Rick, dead center, his arm extended as if holding everyone together, the self-proclaimed glue of the family. But the picture lied. It had been 5 years since that day, and I hadn't seen most of them since. The cracks that the photo couldn't capture had grown into chasms. My parents no longer spoke to Sarah's mom, Aunt Linda, my brother avoided family gatherings altogether, and me. I spent most holidays dodging calls, unwilling to face the questions or the pain that came with them. Still, I couldn't say no when the invitation came for another reunion, same house, same weekend. Maybe it was guilt, or maybe it was hope. A part of me wanted to believe we could fix what had been broken. But as I stared at that photo, the knot in my stomach tightened. Uncle Rick's face seemed to mock me, his easy smile so at odds with the truth I'd uncovered about him just weeks after the last reunion. Back then, I hadn't said a word, too stunned by the weight of what I'd learned. I thought silence would protect us. I thought it would keep the family intact. I was wrong. Because Rick's lies didn't just stay buried, they festered. And the scars they left behind were deep enough to split a family in two. This time, I wasn't sure we could come back from it. 5 years ago, the smell of barbecue filled the air, mingling with the tang of lemonade and the faint musk of sunscreen. My parents' lake house was alive with laughter and clinking glasses. Uncle Rick stood by the grill, flipping burgers with one hand and holding court with the other, his stories larger than life. You should have seen me back in the day, he was saying, his voice booming over the gentle lapping of the water. I was the fastest quarterback our town had ever seen. State champion, 1988. No one could touch me. I rolled my eyes from the deck, pretending to be engrossed in my phone. I'd heard that story 100 times, and I wasn't the only one. My brother, Kyle, leaned over and muttered, if he mentions the state championship one more time, I'm jumping in the lake. I stifled a laugh, but Kyle wasn't kidding. He'd always been the one to clash with Rick the most, his no-nonsense attitude a stark contrast to Rick's bravado. But that day, Rick was in his element, basking in the attention of a family desperate to believe in the illusion of togetherness. The reunion had been my mom's idea, a way to bring everyone back to the lake house after years of drifting apart. We need this, she'd said. For the kids. For us. At first, it worked. The kids played tag on the lawn while the adults reminisced. My cousin Sarah and I sat on the dock, feet skimming the water, talking like we used to before college and life had pulled us in different directions. Even Kyle seemed to let his guard down, laughing at Dad's bad jokes. But the cracks were there, just beneath the surface. I saw it in the way Aunt Linda avoided eye contact with my mom, their conversations were clipped and polite. I felt it when Kyle's voice sharpened every time Rick started to spin another tale, his patience wearing thin. And then there was Sarah, who flinched every time her dad raised his voice, even if it was in laughter. Later that night, after the food was eaten and the kids were asleep, the adults gathered around the fire pit. I was half listening, my mind drifting, until I heard Rick say something that made my stomach twist. You know, Linda, you've always had a knack for spending other people's money. The firelight flickered across Aunt Linda's face as she froze, her wine glass halfway to her lips. Excuse me, she said, her voice tight. You heard me, Rick said, leaning back in his chair like he'd just won an argument no one else was privy to. You've been living off of John's inheritance for years. Must be nice to have someone else do all the work, huh? The group fell silent. Aunt Linda's husband, John, had passed away years ago, leaving her to raise Sarah and her younger brother on her own. It was no secret she'd struggled financially, but no one had ever dared to say it out loud, until Rick. That's enough, my mom said sharply, her eyes flashing. But Rick just shrugged, taking another swig of beer. What? I'm just saying what everyone's thinking. She's been milking this family for years. Someone had to say it. Linda stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the patio. You have no idea what I've been through, she said, her voice shaking. And you have no right, to talk about John that way. She stormed off, and the rest of the night unraveled. My mom and Rick got into a heated argument, Kyle walked away muttering curses under his breath, and Sarah sat by the fire, her face pale and eyes distant. It wasn't until the next morning, when most of the family had left, that I found out the truth. I'd gone to grab my phone from the kitchen counter when I overheard my mom and dad talking in hushed voices. Rick's been lying for years, my dad said, his voice low. The gambling, the debt, hell, he even borrowed money from Linda and never paid her back. He's my brother, my mom said, but her voice wavered. What am I supposed to do? Turn my back on him? You should have done that years ago, my dad snapped, before he dragged everyone else into his mess. I froze, my hand hovering over my phone. Gambling. Debt. Uncle Rick, the man who always bragged about his successes, who acted like he had it all together. It didn't make sense. Except it did. Suddenly, all the pieces fell into place, the tension at family gatherings, the whispered conversations, the way Rick always seemed to deflect when money came up. And now, his attack on Aunt Linda wasn't just cruel, it was calculated. A way to deflect attention from his failures. I wanted to say something, to confront him, but I didn't. I told myself it wasn't my place, that it wasn't worth tearing the family apart over. But as the years passed, I watched the family fracture anyway. And now, as I prepared to face them all again, I couldn't help but wonder if staying silent had been the biggest mistake of all. The lake house looked almost the same, like it had been frozen in time since the last reunion. The paint was still a little chipped on the porch railing, the wind chime in the corner still jingled with the faintest breeze, and the smell of pine and charcoal still clung to the air. But the atmosphere was heavier, like the house itself remembered the fractures we'd left behind. The reunion started smoothly enough, forced smiles, obligatory hugs, and awkward small talk. Uncle Rick was, as always, larger than life. He held a beer in one hand and a cigar in the other, already halfway into a story about his legendary business deal that supposedly landed him a fortune. I avoided him like the plague. Instead, I found myself on the deck with Sarah, who looked even more withdrawn than I remembered. She was sipping a glass of wine, staring out at the lake. "You okay?" I asked, breaking the silence. She glanced at me, her eyes shadowed. "You mean besides being dragged back here for another family circus?" She tried to smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Yeah. Besides that." She hesitated, her fingers tightening around her glass. "It's nothing," she said finally. "I'm just tired." I didn't push her. Maybe I should have. As the evening wore on, the tension became harder to ignore. It was in the clipped exchanges between Aunt Linda and Uncle Rick, the way my mom kept shooting my dad warning glances every time Rick opened his mouth, and the way Kyle disappeared the moment Rick started talking. Dinner was the turning point. We were all crammed around the long dining table, passing dishes and pretending everything was fine. Uncle Rick, of course, dominated the conversation, his voice booming over everyone else's. "So, Kyle," he said, leaning back in his chair, still working that dead-end job. "Or have you finally decided to make something of yourself?" The room went silent. Kyle's jaw clenched, but he didn't look up from his plate. "It's not a dead-end job," he muttered. Rick chuckled, shaking his head. "Come on, kid. You're smarter than that. You could be doing so much better if you'd just get your act together." "Rick," my mom said sharply, "that's enough." But he wasn't done. "I'm just saying what everyone's thinking. The kid's wasting his potential. Hell, if he had half my drive, he'd be running his own business by now." That was when Kyle snapped. "You mean like you," he shot back, his voice rising, "running it right into the ground and blaming everyone else when it all falls apart." The words hung in the air, sharp and cutting. Rick's face darkened, and for a moment, I thought he might lunge across the table. "What the hell are you talking about?" Rick demanded, his voice low and dangerous. Kyle leaned forward, his eyes blazing. "Don't act like we don't all know, Rick. The gambling. The debt. Borrowing money from Linda and never paying it back. You're a fraud, and everyone here knows it." "Kyle," my mom said, her voice a mix of warning and desperation, "stop." But Kyle didn't stop. He turned to the rest of us, his voice rising. "Why are we all pretending he's some kind of hero? He's been lying to us for years, and we just let him get away with it. You all let him get away with it." The table erupted. My mom was yelling at Kyle, Aunt Linda was crying, Sarah was trying to calm her down, and Rick was shouting over everyone, his face red with anger. But I couldn't move. Because amid all the chaos, Sarah's voice cut through, quiet but sharp as a knife. "Tell them the truth, Dad." Everything stopped. All eyes turned to Sarah, who was standing now, her hands trembling. Rick's face twisted into something I couldn't quite read: anger, fear, desperation. "Sarah," he said, his voice low and warning, "don't." She ignored him. "You want to talk about lies? Fine. Let's talk about yours. Why don't you tell everyone what you've been hiding?" "Sarah, sit down," Rick snapped. "No." Her voice cracked, but she didn't back down. "I'm done sitting down. I'm done covering for you." I stared at her, my heart pounding. "Sarah, what are you talking about?" She looked at me, and the pain in her eyes was like a punch to the gut. "He's not who you think he is," she said, her voice trembling. "He's not the man he pretends to be. He's a liar, and he's been lying to all of us for years." Rick shot out of his chair, his face contorted with rage. "That's enough," he bellowed. But Sarah didn't stop. She turned to the rest of the family, her voice rising. "You want to know why my mom stopped coming to these reunions? Why do we all start drifting apart? It's because of him. He." "Sarah, don't you dare." Rick roared, his voice shaking the walls. The table fell silent, the air thick with tension. And then Sarah said the words that changed everything. "He cheated on my mom. 4 years. And when she found out, he blamed her. Said it was her fault. And when she finally stood up to him, he threatened to ruin her. That's who he is. The words echoed in the stunned silence, their weight settling over the table like a heavy fog. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could do was stare at Rick, his face pale and his eyes darting around the room, searching for an escape. No one said a word. And in that moment, everything fell apart. The silence after Sarah's revelation was deafening. No one moved. No one spoke. It was like the room itself had forgotten how to breathe. I felt my chest tighten, my pulse pounding in my ears. Uncle Rick was the first to break the silence. That's not true, he said, his voice shaky and defensive. She's lying. She doesn't know what she's talking about. But the look on his face said otherwise. Rick, Aunt Linda said softly, her voice trembling. Stop. Just stop. My mom buried her face in her hands, and my dad sat back in his chair, his jaw tight, his eyes darting between Rick and Sarah like he didn't know who to believe, or maybe he didn't want to believe it. Kyle, on the other hand, stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. Unbelievable, he muttered, shaking his head. You've been lying to everyone, and now you're lying to yourself. You're pathetic. Rick's face twisted with anger. You don't know anything, kid. You've always had it out for me. Don't think I haven't noticed. Yeah, because you've made it so easy to respect you, Kyle shot back. You're a joke, Rick. A walking disaster pretending to be the king of this family, and we've all let you get away with it. Enough, my mom's voice cut through the room like a whip. She stood, her hands trembling, her eyes red. Both of you, stop it. This isn't helping. But Kyle didn't back down. He turned to my mom, his voice dripping with frustration. Why are you still defending him? Why do you always defend him? He's the reason we're all like this. I flinched at his words. Because he wasn't wrong. The family had always revolved around Rick, his charisma, his drama, his endless need for attention. He was the sun we all orbited, whether we wanted to or not. And now, it felt like that sun had gone supernova, leaving nothing but chaos in its wake. I didn't know, my mom whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't know about this. Didn't you? Kyle's words were sharp, like a knife. Or did you just not want to see it? That was when I snapped. Stop. I said, my voice cracking. Everyone turned to look at me, their faces a mix of shock and guilt. Just stop. All of you. What's the point of any of this? Screaming at each other isn't going to fix anything. Kyle looked at me, his expression softening slightly. And what do you think will fix it? He asked, his voice quieter now. I didn't have an answer. Instead, I turned to Rick. My hands were trembling, but I didn't care. Why? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Why would you do this? To Aunt Linda, to Sarah, to all of us. Why would you lie about everything? Rick looked at me, and for the first time in my life, he seemed small. The bravado was gone, replaced by something I couldn't quite place, shame, maybe, or fear. I made mistakes, he said finally, his voice hoarse. I didn't mean for it to get this far. I didn't know how to stop. That's not an excuse, Sarah said, her voice cold. You don't get to hide behind your mistakes anymore. He didn't respond. I felt something break inside me, something I hadn't even realized I'd been holding on to. Maybe it was the image of Rick as the fun, larger-than-life uncle who always had a joke or a story to tell. Or maybe it was the idea of our family as something unshakable, something that could weather any storm. But it was gone now. All of it. I can't do this, I said, pushing back my chair. I can't sit here and pretend like any of this is okay. I walked out onto the porch, the cool night air hitting me like a slap. I leaned against the railing, my hands gripping the wood so tightly my knuckles turned white. A few minutes later, Kyle joined me. At first, he didn't say anything, he just stood beside me, staring out at the dark water. You were right, I said finally. About Rick. About everything. Kyle shrugged. Doesn't make it any easier, does it? No, I said quietly. It doesn't. We stood there in silence for a while, the weight of everything hanging between us. You know, Kyle said eventually, we don't have to keep doing this. Letting him pull us into his mess, pretending like it's all fine. We don't owe him that. I nodded, but the knot in my chest didn't loosen. It's just. I thought we were better than this. I thought our family was stronger than this. Kyle sighed. Maybe we were never as strong as we thought. But maybe that's not a bad thing. Maybe now we can stop pretending. I didn't respond. I wasn't ready to think about what came next, about what it would mean to move forward. But as I stood there, the sound of voices rising again inside the house, I realized Kyle was right. We couldn't keep pretending. And maybe, just maybe, that was the first step toward something better. I sat by the lake, my feet dangling off the edge of the old wooden dock. The water was still, the moonlight casting rippling silver patterns across its surface. The sounds of crickets and distant voices from the house faded into the background. It was just me, the lake, and the weight of everything I'd learned tonight pressing down on my chest. For years, I'd looked up to Uncle Rick. He was the life of the party, the one who always had a funny story or a grand plan to share. I wanted to believe in him because he made life feel a little brighter, a little less ordinary. But now, that image was shattered. I picked up a small stone from the dock and rolled it between my fingers, the cool surface grounding me. How could I have been so blind? How could we all have let him hold this family together while he was the one tearing it apart? The water rippled as I tossed the stone into the lake. I watched it sink, disappearing into the depths, and felt a pang of envy. I wanted to sink too, to let the water swallow me whole so I wouldn't have to face the mess waiting back at the house. But then a memory surfaced, unbidden. I was 10 years old, sitting in this exact spot with my mom. She had her arm around me, holding me close as we watched the sunset. Family isn't about being perfect, she'd said. It's about showing up, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. Her words echoed in my mind, and something shifted. For the first time that night, I stopped thinking about Rick and started thinking about the rest of us, Sarah, Kyle, Aunt Linda, my mom. We'd all been hurt by his lies, yes, but we'd also been hurt by each other. By the silence. By the pretending. I stood up, brushing the dirt from my jeans. I wasn't sure what confronting the truth would look like or if it would even make a difference. But I knew one thing, I couldn't run from it anymore. With a deep breath, I turned back toward the house. The voices inside grew louder as I approached, and my stomach twisted with nerves. But for the first time that night, I felt a flicker of strength, a determination to face the truth, no matter how painful it might be. It was time to stop sinking. It was time to swim. When I stepped back inside, the house was quiet. Most of the family had scattered, retreating to separate corners to nurse their wounds. The dining table was abandoned, the remnants of dinner untouched, as if no one could bear to sit there any longer. I found Sarah in the living room, sitting on the couch with her head in her hand. She looked up when she heard me, her eyes red but steady. For a moment, we just stared at each other, the weight of everything unspoken hanging in the air. "I'm sorry," I said finally, my voice cracking. She shook her head. "You don't have to apologize. None of this is your fault." "Maybe not," I said, sitting down beside her. "But I should have seen it. I should have been there for you, for all of this." Sarah exhaled, a shaky, bitter laugh escaping her lips. "We all should have, but we didn't. And now we're here." I nodded, the silence between us no longer awkward but filled with a quiet understanding. "Maybe it's time we stop pretending everything's fine. It's not. It hasn't been for a long time. But maybe we can start doing something about it." Her lips quirked into the faintest smile. "You think this family has a chance?" I hesitated, then reached for her hand. "I don't know. But I think we owe it to ourselves to try." Later, as the family slowly regrouped in the living room, I found my voice. It trembled at first, but it grew stronger as I spoke. I told them what I felt, about the hurt, the silence, and the pretending. About how Rick's lies had fractured us, yes, but how our unwillingness to face the truth had let those fractures fester. By the end, there were tears, Sarah's, my mom's, even mine, but there was also something else, a flicker of hope. That night, as I stood on the porch watching the first light of dawn break over the lake, I felt lighter. The wounds weren't healed yet, but their weight didn't feel as unbearable. We had a long way to go, but for the first time, it felt like we might get there. And for now, that was enough.